Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about album number 4 from the Prodigy, Always Outnumbered, Never Outgunned. So, we all know the Prodigy's first 3 classics, 3 projects back-to-back that cemented themselves as all but untouchable masterworks and some of the most iconic and easily recognizable projects the entire genre of electronic music has to offer, all reaching their own separately revered spots in history for their own separate reasons. But it's also no secret that those first 3 albums get way more press and attention to this day than anything they would ever do afterwards. So, it's finally time to talk about what would eventually break that streak. Well, at least as far as their critical reception would go. The Prodigy have not released a project since Experience that didn't go to number 1 in the UK and sell like gangbusters on name recognition alone, and they'll always have their ride-or-die fans willing to wholeheartedly defend anything they do so long as they continue to bring the bangers as always. But for most people, not including the biggest diehard fans, this band is always going to be associated specifically with the 90s and no other decade. Once the 2000s rolled around, they definitely hit a point when it felt like their reputation and peak irrelevance really started to take a turn. That didn't necessarily happen all at once, though. Perhaps the first sign that something might not be right was the departure of one of the band's original members right at the turn of the millennium. Now, sure, the member in question was Leroy Thornhill, the one guy from the band who never contributed anything on a musical level. He just did dancing, video appearances, and occasionally keyboards and live shows. Though it is maybe funny to note that Thornhill did actually start up a solo career. Shortly after breaking off the band, he put out a whole solo album under the name Flight Crank called Beyond All Reasonable Doubt in 2001. I've heard that album, it's okay. If you're looking for a somewhat cheap-sounding indie rock tinged take on Massive Attack that happens to feature Lee Scratch Perry of all people on one track, then feel free to check that out. Though I don't know if I would say it was interesting enough for me to want to do a video on it. Although it is also worth noting that one of the singles from that album, called What You Need, got a one-off remix by the breakbeat band Genocide 2, that sounds absolutely nothing like the original, but could come pre-packaged with certain Windows computers. I think it was a tie-in with like Music Match Jukebox or something. And I bring this up because that remix is my actual first ever exposure with electronic music in my entire life, full stop. I found it at like age 6 or 7 or whatever. I just coincidentally decided to put it on, seeing it preloaded in Windows Media Player on my dad's computer. And I found it to be the absolute craziest and most mind-blowingly unhinged thing I'd ever heard in my entire life. This bizarre sounding but super hard hitting breakbeat thing with all these crazy stuttered vocal effects and DJ scratching and whatnot. I mean, it's not quite as crazy to me 20 plus years later, obviously. It definitely sounds like a product of that one specific moment in time, but you know, it did low-key kinda change my life, and I still think it holds up as pretty great. This is a completely irrelevant tangent that doesn't have anything to do with anything, but, you know, I don't think I would have ever gotten any other opportunity to mention it. I'm not doing an odds and ends for this series. Leroy Thornhill is still releasing music under his own name with some stuff as recent as last year, if you want to look him up in Bandcamp and stuff, but I've gotten way off track. We're talking about the Prodigy here, so getting back on topic. After the Fat of the Land and Thornhill's departure, the band went on a short hiatus, until eventually in 2002 they would release a comeback single called Baby's Got a Temper. Commercially, that track did decently well. It was hard for anything from them to not be a success after how much success they'd already seen. But there was definitely a sour taste coming off this track that really started to make a lot of people turn on them. See, Keith Flint wrote this track as an ode to doing Rohypnol, a drug often referred to as a date rape drug. The song's not actually about drugging people, it's about Flint and lots of people he's at a party with just all taking the drug themselves of their own free will. But with lyrics like "We love Rohypnol, she love Rohypnol," juxtaposed with "This baby's got a temper, you'll never tame her," I mean, it wasn't difficult to see why people might take it a certain way. It straight up got banned from radio play in the UK altogether, and it got critically thrashed so badly that Howlett even came around to disown it himself. Now, I'm not about to break new ground saying that I think that track was probably the worst they'd released up to that point in their history and still stands as one of their weakest tracks ever. It was definitely a sign that playing into shock value and shallow controversy of the smack my bitch up variety was only going to get them so far, and might start to become more trouble than it was worth when they weren't attaching it to an insta-classic track that was so obviously great that people would still want to play it anyway. Though the controversy isn't nearly the worst thing about that track in my eyes. I mean, I like Flint's performance as much as any other he's given, and what chemicals he was putting into his body at the time isn't my business to judge as far as I'm concerned, even if it might hit an additional weird note after Flint's passing. But what really gets me about that track is that the instrumental has all these weird, annoying clown show synths that really grate on my nerves, and even more egregiously, there's this one part near the beginning that actively samples the instrumental from Firestarter to act as a reminder of, hey, remember us? We're the Firestarter guys and we're back. Like, this is the kind of track that makes the band look washed up, out of ideas, and like a novelty that's run its course. Especially being the first thing they'd released after a 5-year wait, and losing a band member, even if a minor one. Just doing the exact same things their mainstream fans already know them for, and unintentionally telling those people, no, there's really no deeper to go with us than the surface level you're already familiar with. It was a really bad look in so many different ways. Now, even if that track ended up not making the cut for this album, it definitely primed the pump for the album to get the reception it ended up having. I mean, I think that track alone may have just, cut off their chances of continuing to have the same level of international success that The Fat of the Land got them, and pretty much predestined contemporary reviews of the album to have the specific tone they did of feeling like their shtick has gotten old. With that said, having really sat with his album more closely than I ever have previously in order to make this video, I don't know if I'd say that standpoint of the same shtick getting old is really representative of what you get with Always Outnumbered, Never Outgunned. See, Baby's Got a Temper bombing also apparently convinced Howlett to go back to the drawing board with this album and rethink his direction from the ground up. He's quoted as saying this album was meant to remind people of what the band was originally about. The beats and the music, not as much the vocals, which had started to become more the focus on their last album. And as such, they ended up with an album that does not feature a single vocal appearance from Keith Flint or Maxim at all. I mean, no hard feelings, they weren't crucial to the successes of Experience or Jilted Generation, and those are classics, right? But at the same time, this is also an album I've seen described as a Liam Howlett solo album. I feel like I may have even called it that myself in the past. Which on paper is a weird, almost redundant way to describe a Prodigy album. Like, most Prodigy albums are already basically Howlett solo efforts. But I think making an observation like that speaks more to the fact that there was something intangible about this album that just felt off. Always Outnumbered was an album that plausibly sounded like the Prodigy, but also didn't sound like the Prodigy. Something wasn't quite right. Something felt missing from the equation that it was difficult to put a finger on. I myself always tended to write this album off as just more forgettable than the others and leave it at that, never listened to it all that closely and just got into it on the surface level of delivering more bangers. But while really sitting for it for this video, I gotta say, it was really hitting a weird note that I don't know if I've ever felt out of it before. 3 return listens in, I was starting to think, fuck, is this album just actually really bad and I never even noticed? Is this actually their worst album? Is this worse than No Tourists? I even had to go back to listen to No Tourists to reconfirm for myself, and okay, no, it's not as bad as No Tourists. Like, that album's a lot more phoned in and by the numbers for them. The best track on that album is like a C-tier Pendulum track, and everything else sounds like leftover scraps from other albums. And the production is a noticeable step down, too. Like, if I sit through that album front to back and immediately put on Spitfire right after hearing those, the difference in sound quality is just night and day. This album, we got actual satisfying bass, we got percussion hitting with actual impact instead of everything indiscriminately reduced to loud percussive white noise with a chipmunk hook. The one thing I have always had to give credit to Always Outnumbered for was its mixing and mastering, which is really well polished. The sound quality is really clear and well balanced without feeling too blunt or loud for its own sake. Honestly, I think purely in terms of the production, I might say it was their best sounding project up to this point. Shout out to Emily Lazar. The problem, of course, comes in the fact that the actual compositions on display here are, on average, not very good. The Prodigy has never been a smart band, but even by their standards, this stuff felt really dumbed down and overly simplistic. Most tracks have one idea and don't try to develop or build on it. It also feels like a weird attempt to bridge the gap between what worked about their early work in the Experience era and what worked about their mainstream The Fat of the Land era, that ended up taking parts from both eras that aren't as favorable and don't really work together. Some of the annoying chipmunk samples and female vocals trying to be incorporated into their new style full of hard-edged machismo was the kind of thing that left a weird taste that I did not like. Especially the way all the female vocalists are used all over this album, such as Juliette Lewis, Princess Superstar, and the Ping Pong Bitches. They have a tendency to feel, like, out of place trying to fit into the Prodigy sound, like an attempt to add overt sex appeal that the band never previously had. And it's weird, not really in a good way. Like, if this album had come out of a band I had never heard of, I might be able to let it slide, especially bringing in a band called the Magnificent Ping Pong Bitches, who clearly already wanted this to be the image they were putting out. But it's jarring to hear this kind of stuff coming off the heels of such a ridiculously masculine album as The Fat of the Land. And the context of following up an album like that with something like this makes all the appearance of female singers here feel all the more like shallow sex objects in service of a male power fantasy. There's a track here called Girls, about getting rich and famous and meeting all the young girls. The hook of the track Hotride is Gimme 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 a Ride, and talks about taking a ride on your hot air balloon. It's not subtle what this is trying to be about. I mean, in one breath, it's not like this kind of thing was ever going to appeal to me in the first place, because you already know what I'm gonna say here. But it still just felt kinda wrong for the band who made Smack My Bitch Up to be trying stuff like this. It's probably the one biggest element of this album that differs from all their other ones and feels the least Prodigy-like. And then we have to get into the tracks themselves on this thing, which, at best, are a mixed bag. The album does at least start out pretty decent. I already praised the production on Spitfire, solid enough banger to start us off. Although the hook on that one does absolutely get repetitive, and at 5 minutes feels longer than it deserves to be. I mean, it's great if you listen to it right after No Tourists, but if you listen to it after one of their actual classics, it does still feel like a downturn. Meanwhile, in spite of my highlighting Girls as a weird track for the Prodigy specifically to be making, that is almost certainly the best track on the album. Kinda going for an 80s electro vibe here that stands out in a good way. Punchy, to the point, not annoying. And even if the sampled lyrics do sometimes strike me as like an under-the-radar way for Liam Howlett to flex how big and successful he's gotten, the fact that the lyrics are also delivered by women, the above-mentioned Magnificent Ping Pong Bitches, does allow it to hit a little different and give it some queer energy that you wouldn't be hearing anything even slightly leaning in the direction of since the Experience days. Beyond that, I may have slagged off the other single, Hotride, for its hook. And let's make it clear, it is probably the worst hook of any track on this album. The whole gimme 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 shit just drives me up the fucking wall. But if you can get past that, the actual groove underscoring this track is easily the hardest hitting and effectively propulsive out of any track here. It's like taking a 60s surf rock beat with all these kick-ass fuzzed out guitars trying to add up to this Pulp Fiction-y vibe, and manages to get away with being marked as a highlight on that merit in spite of its obvious problems. Medusa's Path is a pretty solid instrumental, not really a fan of that carnival-sounding sample that starts it off. But once it gets going, it's a fun enough time, bringing back some of those Weather Experience-style synth strings over a brittle mix of beat work, and despite being the longest track here at 6 minutes without much in the way of actual evolution, it surprisingly doesn't drag as much as other tracks on the album, which are even shorter. And I think the album does end decently strong as well, with the track Shoot Down. That features both the Oasis brothers, Liam Gallagher singing and Noel on bass guitar. How'd you manage to get them on the same track? Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty shallow track and a lot of the lyrics are bang, 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 but it goes pretty hard. I think it works well for what it's going for. And there are other tracks here I guess are passable. Memphis Bells is fine as a more hip-hop and proto-trap leaning instrumental with lots of buzzing bass, kind of a marginally more experimental moment for the album that helps it give more flavor that isn't distasteful or out of place. And I guess You'll Be Under My Wheels is cool too, though that's another track that feels like it's dragging on longer than it is. I mean, the string riffs, guitar riffs, wobbling synth arpeggios, off-kilter beats, and samples of a rock, a roll. While definitely all interesting when put together, makes for a mix that doesn't retain that novelty for the full length of the track. It gets a little tedious eventually. And while we're on the topic of tedious, let's give it up for the several different tracks on this thing which I definitely think fall within straight up bad territory. I mean, maybe there will be elements that could work, but they get way overshadowed by other elements that don't. See, for instance, Get Up, Get Off. That features hyperspeed rap performances from Twista of all people that are solid, but yet he barely takes up any time next to having to say, if you wanna get up, over and over, or a snippet of Juliette Lewis doing the same in a way screechier voice. That track sucks, and it only gets significantly worse with some of these others. Wake Up Call features a solidly hard-hitting beat and a hook from Kool Keith, but it gets so unbearably repetitive over the course of nearly 5 minutes. This is a track that had enough material to fill out maybe 2 minutes if I'm being generous, but it just hits you with the same thing over and over. Back on to a 1, 2, 3, well, back on 4, you better wake up. Copy-pasted verbatim 13 times, and that's not even to get into the chipmunk snippets of just can't wake up, and all the samples of all the fucking alarm bells cut out of the opening seconds of Pink Floyd's Time. Holy fucking shit, why would you ever want to make something like this, let alone choose to listen to it? And somehow that's only the second most annoying track on the album. The worst one is Action Radar. The vocals from Paul Dirt Candy Jackson are just the absolute fucking most annoying thing in the world, like he's trying to do some kind of punk screaming. And once again, it's just the same hooks copy-pasted over and over in between more of those female vocals trying to be sexy and talk about a little action is all I need. It is just such a damn unending headache, and that one's even 30 seconds longer than Wake Up Call. Those two back-to-back tracks are legit some of the absolute worst tracks to have ever come out of the Prodigy. Oh, but if you thought I was done ranting, I haven't even gotten to the 2 tracks here with really fucking lazy sampling. The track Phoenix builds itself entirely around a sample of the Shocking Blues Love Buzz, and turns this off-kilter 60s song into like a jerky-ass, annoying proto-dubstep mix. It sounds like it's got the vocals and guitars in different keys on accident, even though it's the same as the original and it sounds natural enough in the original. And that doesn't even compare to The Way It Is, a track that builds itself entirely around a cheap sample of, I shit you not, Michael Jackson's Thriller. Well, I guess that sample is going to be anything but cheap, but cheap in the sense that Howlett doesn't fucking do anything with it. He just jacks the beat from Thriller, cuts out any of the actual tunes or hooks, gives it a bit more distortion, adds a few half-whispered female vocal snippets which are barely even there, and that's fucking it. Like, are you fucking kidding me? I mean, these obviously aren't the only 2 tracks on the album that use samples, but they are the 2 that by far most feel like they're using them as a crutch to skip the whole, like, actually making a new Prodigy song thing. Those feel like the really obvious sampling that you might hear on a modern-day TikTok hit, or more accurately, like some of those, like, shitty P. Diddy productions from the time. You cannot tell me that a song like this is Liam Howlett actually bringing his A-game. Some of this shit is absolutely inexcusable. But yeah, that's everything on Always Outnumbered, Never Outgunned. I'm not really the biggest fan of this album. I don't hate it. I don't think it's completely without merit, and I even get where the diehards who really defend this stuff come from. It is a weird moment for the Prodigy that doesn't sound like anything else in their catalog, and it shows Howlett occasionally taking some risks. I don't personally agree with the contemporary reviews that said this was merely Prodigy by the numbers with not enough of a twist to feel novel and like the first sign of stagnation for the band that would kill off their peak of relevance. Not to say there's at least some truth to that, like it did in fact kill off their peak of relevance, and regardless of what you think about their stuff afterwards, spoilers, I do think they at least partially recovered from this. It can't really be denied that all their following albums have definitely stuck to a single familiar template without even trying to like innovate or change up their sound like they seem to do so effortlessly in the 90s. The heights of those initial classics were never and will never be matched by the band again. But to leave this album as pure stagnation and doing the fat of the land again, no, there's definitely plenty of ideas you get on this album that you don't get on any other Prodigy album, and I do have to respect it on that merit at the very least. But at the same time, the risks this album takes aren't really that risky, and still make for the kind of project that still feels really easily commercially viable. This album may have been the first to sell less than their previous projects, but I mean, literally anything they would have put out couldn't have measured up to The Fat of the Land in terms of sheer cultural penetration. In the grander scheme of things, this album still sold really well, obviously. It's still a Prodigy album. But it's also a Prodigy album that I've never had that much fun with. As far as I'm concerned, this is their equivalent to the Chemical Brothers' We Are the Night. There's lots of interesting aspects to this album to talk about, but most of those aspects aren't actually positive ones. It finds a lot of different ways to make me feel like something's out of place or doesn't quite work for me, or just regular old annoy me. I never hated this album when I put it on in previous years and always thought it was just okay, and I still think it's just okay, not terrible. It's still not their worst when No Tourists is sitting right there. And that's also an album I only think is really mediocre and not irredeemable. But, I mean, yeah, making this video definitely made me appreciate why Always Outnumbered has the reputation of being the stinker that finally lost many an old 90s fan. There's no shame in not being the Fat of the Land, but that doesn't make me feel the sharpness of the drop-off in quality any less, and yeah, I'm feeling like a 5.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.